The Lord's Spirit rushed over him. The ropes on his arm became like burned up linen, and the ties melted right off his hands. He found a donkey's fresh jawbone, because if you're going to use a donkey's jawbone, make it fresh. Picked it up and used it to attack 1,000 men. Samson said, with a donkey's jawbone, stacks on stacks. With a donkey's jawbone, I've killed 1,000 men. When he finished speaking, he tossed away the jawbone. And that place became known as Ramoth Lehi, which means Jawbone Hill. What do you think about that story? What do you think about that story? What happens in that story? Let's go through a little bit of those passages. Verse 3, Samson replied, well, nobody can blame me now for being ready to bring down trouble on the Philistines. Nobody can blame me. They slighted me, right? Nobody would blame me for bringing down trouble. And when Samson brings down trouble, it usually means somebody's going to die, right? Like that's what his idea of trouble is. Next, he responded, well, if this is how you act, then I won't stop until I get revenge on you. If this is how you act, this guy has tied 300 foxes' tails together. And now he's saying, well, this is how you act. Next, Samson told him, I just did to them just what they did to me. I just did to them what they did to me. And after this, we go into the story. Actually, there's a story about Samson and a prostitute and him carrying a town gate away. I'll leave that one for you to read on your own. And then you come to the story of Samson and Delilah. And it's often, when you read this story, Delilah is the bad guy in the story, isn't she? She's the one who's asking Samson what his secret is to his strength. And he lies to her, and then she screams, the Philistines are upon you. And he breaks whatever they've tied him up with, right? And then finally she asks again a few times later, what is your secret to your strength? And he says, if you cut my hair, I'll be like a normal person. And so he goes to sleep, she cuts his hair, and says, the Philistines are upon you. And then they come in and take him prisoner. If you're Samson, every time you tell her the wrong answer, she says, the Philistines are upon you, and they show up in the room. Like, is it really her fault? It's like tweeting your credit card number and being ticked that somebody used it. Right? You're telling her, this is why I'm so strong. I have this vow with God. If you cut my hair, I'll be like a normal person. And it's exactly what happens. I think Delilah is actually not the bad guy in the story. I think Delilah is just doing what they've all been doing, right? Maybe they're all bad guys in the story, including possibly Samson. And so Samson is taken prisoner by the Philistines, and his eyes are gouged out. And they bring him to the temple of their god Dagon. And they're celebrating that the guy who's been killing so many of them is now blind and weak and in chains. And Samson, in that moment, next slide, here's how he responds. Samson grabbed the two central pillars that held up the temple. He leaned against one with his right hand and the other with his left. Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. He strained with all his might, and the temple collapsed on the rulers and all the people who were in it. So it turned out that he killed more people in his death than he did during his life. That's sort of the end of the Samson story. That's how they end it. So it turned out that he killed more people in his death than he did in his life. And I don't know. I think maybe the author of Judges means that as sort of a bragging point. Right? Like we thought he was good in life, but he even did more in death, right? Like that sort of thing. But is Samson a hero? How many of you grew up being sort of taught that Samson was a hero? When you hear these stories, is Samson a hero? Is he somebody to emulate? Is he somebody to pattern your life after? Is he somebody like, I really hope my kid grows up to be like Samson? Is that what we want? It's funny how sometimes the people in the Bible who are billed as heroes are actually not very heroic at times. There's a commentator named Clinton McCann. He says this: while Samson certainly is a hero of sorts, his story comes at a point in the book of Judges that suggests that Samson is also the worst of the judges. Things have been getting progressively worse since Gideon. And after Samson, things denigrate into utter chaos. As the final judge, Samson represents not the glorious culmination of the series of judges, but rather its abysmal conclusion. Although Samson's feats were impressive, and although he killed many Philistines, at best he only began to deliver Israel from the Philistine oppressor. So he didn't actually do the thing he was supposed to do. At the end of Samson's life and his story, things are no better than they were before. Like, isn't that the last thing that we would want to be said about us? Is like, they left the world worse than they found it. Well, if we don't want that to be said about us, first of all, we've got work to do. Are you with me? We don't want to leave the world worse than we found it. Samson leaves the world and his people in a worse situation than when he found. He was supposed to deliver them and liberate them, and he actually only made it worse. What do we do with the story of Samson? Like, I don't think Samson's a hero. I think this is actually a cautionary tale. Right? It's a cautionary tale that when you live by this sword, when you live by revenge, when you live by retaliation, when it becomes your goal to get even with everybody who's ever hurt you, and whether you do that physically or whether you do that emotionally or whether you do that verbally, when revenge is the reason you exist and you live by that sword, you will always die by that sword. There's not really a revenge story that actually turns out where everybody lived happily ever after. Have you noticed that? I mean, at what point, as you're seeking revenge, at what point does somebody go, you know what, totally deserve that? Like after Samson burns with the foxes, he burns down their grain, are the Philistines going to go, well, you know, that guy did give his wife to somebody else, so maybe we deserve to have our economy ruined because of that? Is that how that's going to happen? See, when you live by the sword of revenge, you die by the sword of revenge. So what do we do with this story? One of the things that we do as people who follow Jesus, we try to see where the Jesus story interacts with this, where the Jesus story interacts with the Samson story. And it doesn't in any sort of obvious way. It's not that Jesus is going, Samson, don't be like that guy. But Jesus does offer teaching about what it means and how we are called to respond to difficult people in our lives. Listen to these words from Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Where does it say that? It says it in the Bible, right? It says it in the book of Leviticus. It's called the law of retaliation. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Now, here's the thing. When the law of retaliation came to be, it was actually a dramatic leap forward in the world. Because what it meant was there were limits. If somebody steals your chicken, you can't cut their head off. You can steal their chicken, right? If somebody gouges out your eye, you can't gouge out both of their eyes. It's an eye for an eye. It was meant to limit violence. And like we do as human beings, we see that as license, and then it becomes an excuse for violence. We have Gandhi with those great words, essentially that eye for an eye will leave the whole world blind, right? Eventually you run out of eyes. And so Jesus says, imagine Jesus saying like this, you've read it in the Bible. Is it possible that we can read things in the Bible that do not reflect the way we were meant to live? We've sort of been taught that everything in the Bible, we should do it all and put it all into practice. Do we really? Is that really what we're being invited to do? Actually, there are times when you read the Bible and to do what it says would be a violation of commitment and fidelity to God and your neighbor. This is why the Bible is difficult. This is why trying to sort out what it means to live in response to this text we have. This is why it's a challenge. This is why everything's not as simple as sort of the bill of goods that we were sold a long time ago seemed to paint it. It's just not that easy. Jesus said, you've heard it said in the Bible, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I say to you that you must not oppose, and the word oppose there, it means violently. It's a military term. So Jesus is not saying don't resist. He's saying don't oppose violently those who want to hurt you. If people slap you on your right cheek, turn the left of them as well. When they wish to haul you to court and take your shirt, let them have your coat too. When they force you to go 1 mile, go with them too. Give to those who ask, and don't refuse those who wish to borrow from you. Now here's what's really interesting about what Jesus does. He says, of course, and we've done this, we've covered this in teachings, and you can go to our website if you want to hear one of those from the past. Essentially, what Jesus is teaching his disciples is actually how to resist. How do you resist an oppressive domination system? How do you resist a system that puts you on the bottom and gives you no dignity, no value, and no respect. Well, one of the ways people wanted to resist was by killing lots and lots of Roman soldiers. That seemed to be, there were a group of people who wanted to do that, and they eventually did that, and it ended poorly. They died by the sword. Jesus, in saying turn the other cheek, I mean, the way you would be hit with one hand is the way you would hit an inferior. But to turn the other cheek means that now you have to be hit as an equal. If you have two garments on and they take one and Jesus says gives the other, what does that leave you with? It leaves you with naked, right? And in the ancient world, being naked didn't bring shame. It was viewing someone else's nudity that brought shame. So essentially, Jesus is saying, if you want to show them how dehumanizing they are, just let them have even the shirt off your back, and maybe they'll see. Right? Jesus isn't telling his followers, don't resist. Let people use you as a doormat. Here's what Jesus is saying. Resist the empire. Resist it. But do not play by its rules. You must be more creative, and you must do this in a kingdom of God sort of way. I mean, when you really look at the story this way, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were all forms of resistance. He's resisting the brutality and the inhumanity and the evil of empire. And as he does it, he doesn't let it change him. He doesn't become this hate-filled person. He prays for their forgiveness. But he refuses to play by their rules. And I think part of what Jesus is getting at here is absolutely we have to find a way to not become a doormat, but at the same time, we must find a way to not let this whole system change us. When we start throwing punches, we're just actually making the problem worse. Samson starts throwing punches and beating people with jawbones, and he leaves the world worse than he found it. Right? That idea that you'll ever be able to kill your way to peace, or that idea that you'll ever be able to get them just with one more barb than they hit you with, right? Because in most of our lives, like, we don't do this anymore. After we got out of high school or middle school, we stopped fighting each other in the bathroom, right? Now we do it on social media, or now we do it behind somebody's back. Now it's, through a gesture as we're passing them on the highway. Pick your poison. And this essentially just keeps it. It's like, how many of you had an Atari? Yeah. We were at a store the other day, and I saw a Super Nintendo system that they've come back out with. And I thought it was so cool. And I was trying to tell our almost 9-year-old how cool this was. And he's like, no, it's not. Okay. And then I showed him, you remember those football games where it's just your lines on the screen and you're trying to make, how many of you remember that? And they just come back out with them again. And it's so cool. I was showing him this. He was like, where are the graphics? It's like, no, you don't understand. This is so much fun. He's like, no, it's not. Right? But if you grew up with an Atari, how many of you played the game Pong? Right? And what is the point? Of whether you're playing that on an Atari or whether you're playing ping pong with somebody, what is the point of that game? They send it to you, and what do? Send it back. And who loses? Whoever doesn't get it back over the net, or whoever lets it go off the table, right? So it's just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the winner is the one usually who screams and slams it as hard as possible. I'm terrible at ping pong. That happens to me on the first try. Like, it's bad. But you win by doing better, by sending it back. And yet, when we take that and apply it to life and relationship and friends or neighbors or especially our enemies, that just creates a system where we're just going back and forth, and it never really stops. It never really ends. Nobody ever says, I grew up in Hatfield-McCoy country. That's where I'm from. And if there's a cautionary tale, it's that one, right? Like, at what point does somebody go, let's wave the white flag. You guys win. We lose. Does anybody ever do that? Even when you think about a global scale, you know what happens at the end of war typically? One side loses, not because they had a change of heart, because they got blown up worse. And then what happens? They want revenge. Right? Nobody ever loses in a back and forth sort of retaliation event. Nobody ever goes, we really got what we deserved. And Jesus says the way you respond is you jump out of that system and you break those rules and you say, regardless of what you do to me, I will not treat you the way you're treating me. I will assert my dignity. I'll assert my humanity. Can you imagine if you find out somebody gossiped